Good morning to everyone in this virtual space, and thank you for having me. My name is Andreina Malki, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of Geography at UNC Chapel Hill. And today we'll be talking about a community-engaged project that I carried out during the summer of 2020 that fits within the conversations and theorizations of community geography. This project established an anti-eviction information line designed for Latinx, Spanish-speaking, immigrant, and undocumented communities in North Carolina. And it was a collaborative project between a grassroots community organization in North Carolina and a civil legal assistance clinic of the UNC School of Law. I coordinated this project, which aimed to provide legal information about the CARES Act eviction protections to counter the massive wave of evictions happening in the state during the pandemic through research, data sharing, and action. I will structure my talk in this way. First, I'll talk about the partners of the project. Then I'll talk a little bit about the context of the project. I will describe the projects and the outcomes, and I will end the talk with project learnings and reflections for community geography. So I will begin by talking about the project partners, Siembra NC and the Civil Legal Assistance Program at the UNC School of Law. Siembra is a grassroots organization that formed in the wake of the Trump election in 2016, and it is focused on defending our communities from ICE and abusive employers and landlords. Siembra operates in numerous rural and urban counties in North Carolina, and I have been organizing with this group for a few years prior to the start of the project. The UNC Civil Legal Assistance Clinic is one of 10 clinics in the clinical programs at the UNC School of Law, and they represent individual clients and collaborate with community groups on tenants' rights, worker rights, and other areas of racial, economic, and gender justice. The director of the clinic and the staff of the clinic played key roles in the project. I received the funding to support this project from the Humanities for the Public Good at the College of Arts and Sciences at UNC Chapel Hill. This is a 4-year, $1.5 million initiative intended to recognize and catalyze publicly engaged scholarly activity among humanists and humanistic social scientists. It was initiated by the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences with support from the Institute for the Arts and Humanities and funding from the Mellon Foundation. They offer grants and programmatic opportunities primarily aimed at graduate students and faculty in partnership with institutions within and beyond the academy. This program makes publicly engaged work legible to the academy and provides support for work that it would have otherwise been doing on a volunteer basis, regardless of the funding. So the CARES Act was the legislation that passed to provide relief from the pandemic, and it had a number of clauses. But for the purposes of this talk, it protected an estimated 30% of units nationwide from eviction until at least July of 2020. And it covered properties that received federal subsidies, tax credits, or had federally backed mortgages. The Chief Justice order in North Carolina requires that landlords state whether their property was covered by the CARES Act or not at the time of an eviction hearing. However, landlords benefited from an information advantage as to whether the law applied or not, because tenants do not necessarily know what type of mortgages the properties that they rent have. We thought that the tenants should get an opportunity to test the landlord's claims and access the underlying documents when they get taken to court for eviction. The problem was that the database that allowed the public to check if their property was covered, such as the ProPublicas database, were only available in English. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about how the idea for this project emerged in the first place. To assess how Siembra's grassroots space was experiencing the pandemic, I helped conduct a survey of 300 undocumented people in North Carolina, 45% of whom reported not being able to pay full rent in May. At the time that this information line was operating or began operating, Latinx people in North Carolina made up 42% of the cases and only 9% of the population. Another study by the UNC School of Public Policy found that 37% of Latinx or Hispanic families did not receive a stimulus check, which was a crucial lifeline for many struggling families. Many immigrant families in the state do not qualify for federal or state benefits. And immigrant and Latinx people in the state are more likely to be essential workers, less likely to have health insurance. There were also many language and technology barriers to accessing critical information. We know that evictions are always violent and life-threatening and very traumatic, and they were particularly so during COVID, when the main public health message at the time was stay at home. Just very briefly, I want to acknowledge that housing precarity and evictions are not new problems in the state, but were exacerbated by the pandemic. North Carolina has 5 of the top 25 cities with the highest eviction rates in the country. So now I'm going to briefly describe how this information line operated. People would text their address and the staff at the clinic would check and respond. Each person that contacted the line, whether their property was covered on the database or not, received an information package. If their property was covered under the CARES Act protections, the staff at the clinic would send know your rights information and a letter to give to the magistrate judge at the time of the hearing as a defense against the eviction proceedings. If the property was not covered, they would also receive the same know your rights information and a letter instructing that the burden of proof to show that the property was not covered was on the landlord. So they could also use that letter during the eviction proceedings. Other information included short infographics that I designed for social media and WhatsApp groups, because those were the main ways that the people using the line communicated. A guide to the protections of the CARE Act, a guide to self-representation in an eviction proceeding, a guide to requesting an interpreter in court. And if people needed further help or wanted to take further action, such as court accompaniment, organizing support to take collective action with their neighbors, support and interpretation, or something of that sort, they would contact Siembra's hotline, which is a separate hotline that I also helped operate. These are just examples of the type of graphics that I developed to summarize very complex legal information and translate that information. And I want to mention that a key part of this project was the outreach that we did. We had extensive coverage in Spanish-speaking media as well as English media. And we held Facebook Lives on the Siembra North Carolina page describing the resources provided by the information line, and we invited lawyers to conduct Know Your Rights trainings in various virtual spaces in Spanish. And we know that this was effective because we saw notable increases in the use of the information line immediately following a news report or some other virtual event that talked about the existence of the hotline. So I want to go over some of the outcomes of the project. The total number of contacts were 267, but only 166 people gave enough information for us to be able to mail a hard copy packet. Of those that contacted us and whose properties were listed on the ProPublica database, 30% were covered and 70% were not covered. 48% of the properties covered were apartments, 34% were houses, 7% were townhomes, 4% were mobile homes, and 2% were actually hotel rooms. More than 12 people that contacted the hotline went a little further and contacted Siembra for court accompaniment, negotiation with landlord, organizing support, or some other support with interpretation and translation. And of the 12 people that contacted us to work more closely with Siembra, all of them were actually able to stay at home and were not evicted. There were also other qualitative outcomes that are not so easily measurable in the quantitative terms. And this included people learning that they have rights as tenants, regardless of their documentation status. And people knowing that they're not alone or they're not the only ones facing eviction. And according to people's testimonies, this reduced feelings of shame around the issue of eviction. So in this last part, I would like to take time to discuss some reflections and how they relate to the field of community geography. And I will start with some more project-specific reflections and then transition to broader reflections about conducting this type of work. One of the primary things that we confirmed through this work was that there were many informal evictions happening. That means evictions that are not court order, but rather a landlord intimidating people into leaving. This is particularly the case among undocumented and immigrant people because they might not fight their evictions in court or contact agencies like code enforcement because they fear police presence, which might also mean collaboration with ICE in some counties in North Carolina. So basically, they are scared to go to court because the police is there, and police in our state is sometimes associated with ICE presence. Secondly, I want to touch on issues of language justice in the judicial system. Although North Carolina fares well in the language services that they provide in the judicial system, such as free court interpreters, they still do not include information about the services when they notice people that they're being evicted or that they have an eviction hearing. So people don't know that they're available. In other states, this information is added to the eviction hearing notice. Additionally, the form to request an interpreter is only available in English. And this was an area where I conducted further research alongside lawyers to find out what other states are doing and how we can push North Carolina to improve on the language justice component, which is very crucial during an eviction hearing or any legal proceeding. I was often the one requesting the interpreters for the people facing eviction hearings. So some of the factors that contributed to the success of the partnership include that the community engagement component was present since the beginning of the collaboration, and the project was initiated by a grassroots community organization. We had diversely positioned partners with different strengths and assets that they could contribute to the project. We had clear and pragmatic goals. We wanted to conduct research on potential eviction protections that might help our people stay at home, to inform people of these avenues so they could stay at home, and to get people involved with collective housing justice work in their community. The grassroots organization that I worked with, Siembra NC, is not any nonprofit organization. They have been doing deep relationship and trust building work in the community and have prioritized place-based strategies. For example, organizing go door to door in neighborhoods and trailer home parks where people actually live. And many of the events are held in the neighborhoods and not at a different location where people have to travel. I also want to make a note about positionality. I had already been part of this organization for a few years. And aside from being a new graduate student, I was also a member of the organization. Community geography extensively discusses positionality in the work. One of the challenges of this positionality for me was to play a different role, that of a researcher or a graduate student, with an organization that I had previously worked with in a different role. The transition in roles from member to researcher was sometimes difficult for me to embody. And I would love to hear more about this from other panelists. Finally, I want to emphasize that research and data sharing in the case of this project was intended as an organizing tool. Although this partnership was successful in keeping at least 12 families at home that we know of because they contacted us, there are limits to this strategy. We initially wanted to do more organizing through this project, but it was such a crisis moment that it was difficult to do that, and we tended to prioritize immediate material needs. Often when tenants contacted us, they were the only neighbor left because other neighbors had already been informally evicted. However, Siembra has continued their tenants organizing work and are currently working with a community of trailer park residents that are attempting to buy the lot where they live, as they are being displaced for development. The organization's housing justice work started with this project, and in that sense, this was a successful experiment on the role of public scholarship in this pandemic moment, as well as solidarities that transverse the university community dichotomies and can spark transformative change. Thank you, and I look forward to Q&A.